delighted to have you all for the first talk in our faculty talk series. And quite aptly, the speaker is the esteemed Professor Murthy from our own institute. He doesn't need much of an introduction, so I'll keep it short. Prior to joining IISER as a faculty, he worked at the National Cancer Institute, which is part of the National Institutes of Health in Maryland. And he has made several key contributions in fields such as apoptosis, immune signaling, E3 ligase biology, and many others. He has been able to publish these in several reputed journals such as Nature, Cell, Science, PNAS, and many more. And these have garnered over 40,000 citations over the years. Also, many of his research work has now been integrated into textbooks. So that gives an idea of the importance of his work. And he's going to be talking about his research experiences and also giving advice for people who are just getting into science like us. So we think it's extremely fortunate that he has agreed to talk, and this will be an extremely informative and enlightening session. Please stay tuned for a short interactive session at the end. And with this short intro, I would like to hand over the mic to Professor Murthy. Please mute your mic and turn off your video unless you're asking questions.
Thank you, Abhi, and thank you all the club members. I'm quite pleased to be here today. Particularly, we have been thinking of this biology club in the School of Biology for a long time. After the new director joined, we have started it again. And finally, we are here now. What I want to see in the long term, the club, in addition to all the academic activities, what I'm hoping is you guys will make a network which will last years and decades to come. And also the club, I wish you all the success. But one more thing, what you can do, I think if you have not done, try to put it in our website, School of Biology website, and then regularly update it, along with all the opportunities that are available to biologists in general and scientists also. What I am looking is also even if you graduate out of IISER, you should maintain the contacts with the club. With those short words, let me start my talk. Okay, so what I'm trying to do today, as Ravi was saying, it's quite informal, in the sense that I made up my mind that it will be of my career for the last maybe more than 30 years. So the slides also, I put it from the very old slides, not the very slides, because how I was maybe 20 years ago or 10 years ago, when I was looking at some of these slides, then all my memories came back. So I wanted it to be that way than 21st century kind of presentation. I hope it is okay with you, but I'll be happy at any time you want to talk, you can always stop me and ask questions. So if the very term biology was introduced only in 1800s and later popularized by Lamarck and other people. But if you take biology as a science of living beings, understanding of nature, what I see is you can go back to maybe 10,000 years when humans started domesticating plants and animals. After closely observing their behavior, realizing the importance of having them domesticated. That also I see as part of the science and understanding which we continue to do now at the molecular level even in 21st century. But when you come close to what we have written information, you will be surprised by even 2,500 years ago, Alcman of Tartan distinguished veins from arteries and also discovered optic nerve. You might realize when I talk most of the time, I'll try to relate mostly to human biology, not necessarily entire biology. So probably I'm a little biased. When I looked at all the things I was trying to talk, then I realized there may be a little slight bias towards human biology. The reason could obviously be, why do we do science? Ultimately, it should get to better understanding of biology in general, and in particular humans, so that the knowledge can be applied for better treatment options, for example. So when you go back about our own India, when you talk about Sushruta, who wrote Sushruta Samhita in 450 BC, they described around 120 surgical instruments and 300 surgical procedures. So they knew in their own limited way how the body functions. When you talk about Aristotle in 350 BC, he made an attempt to comprehensively classify animals. But if you move forward, fast forward, if you are in any medical college or library with medical books, you will not be missing the book of William Harvey, who published in 1628 the anatomical exercise and motion of heart and blood in animals. So the biology that what we are talking or what you are learning in ISER is much different what it was maybe hundreds of years ago. But what we come forward to, that what we learn in maybe 1856, Louis Pasteur stated that unproved microorganisms are responsible for fermentation. And then obviously 1858, all of you know about Darwin's theory and Wallace, they proposed evolution. But if you talk about mid-century, mid of last century, 1950 to 1953, where most of us are connected, Rosalind Franklin and obviously James Watson and Francis Crick identified double helix structure of the DNA. Why is that important? The modern biology, the way we learn most of the time, is trying to understand at the DNA level, genetic level, and all these discoveries and the technology that we use to understand biology started, I would say, from 1950s on. There was a long leap after that. Once the double helix structure came, now we are in a state, the knowledge that we have gained can be used and resulting in probably your own lifetime personalized medicine. If we know in your proteomics, the genetic background, that knowledge will be used by clinicians to prescribe a medicine that best suits for you. Is it really important? You have to understand how medicines are prescribed, how medicines are supposed to work in the body. So far, what we have been doing is non-prescribed medicine works more like a trial and error. It's not really knowledge-based. When the medicines have been developed, most of them, I think around 80% of them plant-derived. People know that they do work against a particular disease, for treatment of a disease, not necessarily know how they work. Obviously, most efficient way of doing is you understand the background of the disease, etiology of the disease. What are the genes responsible? What are the proteins? their function, how it is affected, you design drugs or chemical compounds that can interfere with the function responsible for the pathology. That would be the ideal way to treat individuals. But what we do now is one size fits all. Because a medicine, even for vaccination, people make trials in maybe 30,000 or 50,000 individuals. If they are found to be acceptable, then the vaccine will be released into the market, will be then get into or reach millions of individuals. If you probably recent vaccine that came into the market, HPV vaccine, papilloma virus, we realized in India itself, a handful of people lost their lives because of adverse reaction to the medicine. But if you compare the number of individuals who have taken the loss, maybe the percentage was very minuscule, but nonetheless, individuals lose lives. So personalized medicine, what it helps is understanding genetics. For example, if somebody individual has a breast cancer, a particular drug called X is effective in curing the breast cancer, then you follow the course in what type of individuals it is not effective. The breast cancer patients, what we now know is there is a particular protein called HER2 is upregulated. And when the HER2 upregulation, in the patients with HER2 upregulation, this particular medicine is most effective. Then you can always look for the patient table in the tissue sections and see whether HER2 upregulation is there, then you prescribe a medicine corresponding to that. One step further, though there is an increase in HER2 upregulation, it's not necessary that medicine is effective because some of these individuals acquire mutations in HER2, resulting in the medicine ineffective. So another way to tailor is the clinicians ask for HER2 expression as well as genetic makeup, look at the sequencing, any mutations have accumulated, then you prescribe the medicine. In that way, it becomes more efficient and less toxicity to the individuals with very minimal side effects. That's what we are aiming for as a field. But where all this would lead? We are talking about thousands of years of research. What we can expect, it has already been happening. The average life expectancy is changing, is becoming now 70, close to 70 in India. And you would not be surprised by the time you become old, all the students when you reach 70, 80, maybe living 120, 130 years, maybe enough. You might be able to see individuals living for much longer once this personalized medicine succeeds. And that is where the biology is headed and where your contributions are required. So how I have started my journey, probably I can share some slides. As I was mentioning to you, I wanted to use the same slides without much of a change. So, can you see?
Yes, sir, we can see.
Okay. What is that you see there? Nothing? That's the time I don't remember really. Lot of things in what I have done in elementary school. Only thing I remember vaguely when I was I think 3rd or 4th year elementary school, passing away of my grandmother, maybe 1 or 2 friends I had in the school. Nothing more I remember. But move on. I went to ordinary government schools. Those days government schools used to be run much better than they are being run now. And until 10th, I had Telugu medium. Only in the intermediate I joined for English medium school. Once after graduating from the high school, those days we call our high school is 10th, and then we used to call junior college intermediate, and then degree college for BSc. After left 10th grade, I never had biology. For 5 years, I have never written the words SELL, cell. Then, how did I end up in biology? That is a question of probably, I think I know the answer. So, what is that? I have learned during intermediate and degree. I have done almost like all only mathematics, physics, and chemistry. That was the time. I think even now, the situation is the same. Maths and physics considered to be for people with intellect and critical thinking skills. So as a biologist, I think I can say that. But that was the case that time when we were growing up. Only those people who cannot understand complex calculus, they would opt for biology. So I went ahead and joined only maths and physics and chemistry. But I can say that for me, I was predisposed to biology. Where after degree, during degree, I had chemistry as major, and my favorite chemistry was organic chemistry. Knowing all the ketones, alcohol group, metallic groups, benzene rings, used to be very good in remembering all the structures, the functions of them. So I was really excited with organic chemistry. I got the top marks one could get in organic chemistry. Then I wanted to get into something more complex than organic chemistry. Why I would say that, I used to have a lot of classmates, they always hated organic chemistry because they never could really get good marks in organic chemistry. For them, it was really complicated stuff. But for me, it was easy, so I thought I should take something which is more challenging. If we add bio to the organic chemistry, so bioorganic chemistry or biochemistry would be more interesting. So I got into all the chemistry subjects in the university. Those days we used to have organic, physical, inorganic chemistry, as well as biochemistry. I got admission to all of them. Those days they used to give admission based on either written test or your BS marks, BSc marks. So in the written test also, I had appeared for University of Hyderabad, and then I got into biochemistry there. In Andhra University also, I got into all the courses that I had applied for. But university was a central university, Hyderabad. When I went there, for some reason, I did not like the atmosphere in the campus. I don't know how much of you feel that way, because there was only that the campus was coming up, like your Aishar campus, maybe few of you might remember. And what all I could see in the campus was only boulders, no greenery at all, entire campus. And I grew up in an area all of my life, more like Kerala, that's what you see here. Always greenery, coconut trees, mango trees, banyan trees. I thought I cannot really live in a place so dry without greenery. So I opted for Andhra University, that too biochemistry. So there was a reason, another reason for that. All the classmates that time, they were talking about organic chemistry. Organic chemistry people only aim they had among our classmates is you will get a job immediately after masters, because a lot of companies hire organic chemists how to do the organic synthesis, pharmaceutical companies kind of thing. And one of our family friend, he was a medical doctor in the village. His sister used to live in Michigan, University of Michigan. And I'm pouring my heart here. So in the University of, I think it is they were staying somewhere in Michigan. He was working as a doctor. In Michigan, he used to come to our house. He used to tell stories about America, how America is, how it snows there, how beautiful living in an area with so much snow around. I thought I should be looking that I should have a chance to go there. Then everybody said organic chemistry will not lead you to go to America. Biochemistry would be a better option also. So then I said, okay, let me take a biochemistry. Because you can get into life sciences that is much more promising than organic chemistry. I'm not saying I was right or wrong, but that's exactly what happened. We went to biochemistry, joined biochemistry. Then all of hell broke. It was such an internal turmoil for me. There are two reasons. It was such a cultural shock. Moving from with math, physics, chemistry background to an area, they never talk anything rational or a logical way. That time, that's the way I took it. Everything I felt that time is very abstract. People were, see, we had, the class size was very small, I think 10 to 12 people, if I remember correctly. That's biochemistry. Those days we used to have very few seats in all the areas. So biochemistry was also 10, not 12. Out of 12 people, I was the only one without biology background. Everybody else came from biology background. So they have been tuned to think in a particular way, quite different than what I used to think. And another shock came, so you have to forgive me again for saying this. All 5 years, our classes, our colleges never had girl students. Okay, and the boys used to think they are smarter than girls. When you go to a classroom where girls outperformed boys, it took for a while for me to accept that fact. But somehow I managed it, got out with a distinction, with minimal knowledge in biology, with MSc biochemistry. Then there was a time to decide for PhD. Where should I be going? It so happened that one of the everybody's destination people look for is IISc Bangalore. Or any other national level institution. So I wanted to do more of a molecular biology because in the mid-80s, that was very popular. Molecular biology just taking off, taking a piece of DNA, doing the cloning, genetic engineering, sequencing. That is what I wanted to do. So very few labs in India that time to do these things. Some of them are in IISc, another ones are in CCMB, other one was in BHU, Professor Maharani Chakravarti's lab. It so happened that I gave written test. I was qualified for interview. They had asked me to come and give interview in IISc Bangalore. By that time, I had another offer, confirmed offer from BHU, asking me to join there before the interview date of IISc Bangalore. So I could not really decide whether I should try, not knowing really I will get into IISc or not. Then I might even lose the chance in BHU. So then I thought I would go to IISc directly, go to the professor and ask them. I can even give the name. So I had some friends in IISc Bangalore. I stayed in their hostels in IISc. Then went to see biochemistry department. Professor G. Padmanabhan was there. He was sitting in his room. So probably some of you might hear, he's still active. He's Padma Bhushan now. So I asked him, sir, this is exactly what happened. And so what do you suggest? Should I take a chance or not? He said, Maharani's lab is no less than IISc Bengaluru. That is exactly quote unquote his word. Still rings in my thing. Then I took immediately next day, I came back to BHU, I joined there. And what he said was correct. Correct in the sense, probably Maharani's lab, our lab that time was much better than IISc as far as infrastructure was concerned. But outside the lab, the campus is university setting versus IISc setting. So I'm not really complaining, but I have learned a lot of things from BHU which I could not have learned had I joined IISc or had I got an opportunity to join IISc. So I was quite happy, but that I felt was a little risk. One, I was taking biochemistry, not really knowing what I was getting into. Second, then jumping into BHU, not even trying to appear for interview in IISc Bengaluru. But both things worked for me. So the reason could be probably you can think once you make up your mind, there should not be any reason, should not be looking back and move forward. You see, whatever you have in hand, you take it and try to give your best shot. So after 6 years, and the 6th year I had submitted my PhD. That time we were working on Salmonella viruses. And the name of the virus, it was discovered in the lab called MB78. It was discovered in year 78. MB stands for molecular biology. But people used to call it because of their name, Maharani and Burma. Both were husband and wife, our professor and her husband. Nonetheless, so we have characterized the virus, identified the genes which are responsible for lysis of the cells. So the main work was doing the restriction map. Those days what we used to do is you take different numerous restriction enzymes and then cut them into pieces and measure their size and use the information from the sizes to see which order these fragments are arranged. So that's what we used to call is a physical mapping of the viral gene. That's how I had started. Everything was molecular biology. And then we went ahead and cloned the genes and did confirmation by sequencing. We used to do only manual sequencing those days. So our lab, probably I could claim that I was one of the best sequencers those days in India. Professor used to go to the conference and boast that. And also we have expressed the genes, what we call it J fragment, and try to characterize the function of the viral protein. So what I'm trying to say is in the PhD, for my PhD, we have worked with viruses, identifying the genes that are responsible for different viral functions. And that involves cloning, sequencing, protein expression. All in those days were very difficult because nowadays they are very standard. What I'm talking is early 90s. After that, so here I want to tell you some of the things here, which is more of an experience. So BHU that time, so I presume all of you know where BHU is located. It is located in Varanasi, eastern UP. Flights, we had flights connected to those days to Delhi and Calcutta, I think, if I remember correctly. So any enzyme imported from abroad, we used to rush to Delhi the day it comes and get it customs clear, take the train and bring it back so that the dry ice that comes with it will not be bad. So either we have to go 1,000 kilometers east to Calcutta or 1,000 kilometers northwest to Delhi to release the consignments so that you can bring one vial of enzyme to the lab and then work with it. And it used to be the same case to import S35 methionine, which we used to work to label proteins. It used to come from Emerson abroad. So it was like almost like a 6 months of plan to import one vial. So we thought, for the heck, why should we not synthesize ourselves? So I generated S35 methionine myself, and we used it for almost years to come. We stopped importing after that. So these are some of the interesting things I remember now, how we used to do. And we used to do molecular biology in those days when the outside temperatures were 47, 45 degrees centigrade. So how do you maintain the room temperature at 44? How do you maintain 37 degrees centigrade incubator in the lab? You have to think about those things. In ISHAR, we don't have those problems. After that, I went ahead to US for postdoc. That also happened very funny way. The examiner for my thesis asked me to come and join his lab. So Professor Yamamoto. So then I thought, why don't I take the offer, and went ahead and joined. Then they were doing in vitamin binding proteins, and particularly used to take the cells from the blood cells, PBS, peripheral blood cells, and try to identify or characterize the protein from AIDS patients. What surprised me that time, how dedicated those clinicians were treating with HIV individuals. So HIV, probably you might have known that infection started 1984 or 85, early 80s. So it became an epidemic in the US. People used to keep them away. But what surprised me, what I learned from them, was how dedicated those clinicians were. They hardly used to take any precaution for themselves while dealing with these people. I remember there a very famous clinician who used to come with only gloved hands with 5 ml of HIV positive patient samples. I used to really be very scared even to touch it. Then, because our professor retired, then I moved to Thomas Jefferson University to continue my postdoc of 1 year, where I started focusing on apoptosis, NF-kappa-B or ATP. Here is a little background, probably I may have to give. The professor that time was Imad Al-Namri. He just graduated from Professor Litvak's lab, never had guided any postdoc, had no money and no lab. But he worked with Professor Litvak. Litvak was the chairperson and very famous scientist in the US. And he gave him the free hand. After his 2 labs, he gave Al-Namri 1 lab and asked him to do whatever. So I was his first postdoc, and there our journey started. That was the time people started looking at apoptosis or programmed cell death. Not much was known. Bob Harvey, who later got Nobel Prize, started showing in C. elegans how cell death occurs. And then what we found was SET3, SET4 different proteases may be involved in killing cells. So what we wanted to do that time was, why don't we try that in mammalian cells in C. elegans and see whether the program, whatever the people were talking about, also conserved in mammalian cells. If so, what are the proteins? How do they really function? So for a few years, it became the only thing I had to do, nothing else. So we used to come every day in the morning, 9 o'clock, think what needs to be done. So he used to go away 5 o'clock because he has to write a lot of labs. He was also building up his career. There was nobody else in the lab. So I used to take care of the entire lab work, planning, conducting the experiments, procuring the material, analyzing the data. Next morning by 9 o'clock when he comes, I used to keep all the data ready. We used to discuss, plan next experiment. So that was the advantage. Why I'm narrating this, taking few minutes is, so you guys probably might be thinking, how do I decide which lab to join? So the advantage of joining a young faculty is obviously what I am narrating down. He will be working with you and you learn a lot more how to establish a lab, how to troubleshoot the problem. So you will become more of you get a training partly as a PI also, not only as a postdoc or a PhD student. If you join a very senior person, where everything is already established, you walk into a working lab and the professor will hardly spend time with you. So it's up to you what suits you when you decide which lab to do. So happened with the Alumni group, we could using different strategies. I don't want to get into the details. I think some of the times I mentioned this in the classroom also. What we call is EST using, and we could clone number of genes which we felt has homology to shed proteases, C. elegans proteases involved in them. So 30% identity, 40% identity. So what you need to do is, you have to make a library, cDNA library. And from the EST tags, you identify which are the numbers, IDs probably contain these genes. You design primers, amplify those primers using PCR by the time PCR was already available, and then move ahead to clone it. So every day, we used to do designing primers, doing PCR, doing the transformation, screening. Every day we used to have certain time, all these things until 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the night. That's how we ended up cloning a number of genes. Caspase 3, Caspase 6, Caspase 7, Caspase 8, Caspase 9, Caspase 10, Caspase 11, 13, 14, like that. And when we were doing that, we never really left anything side coming up. Any other genes, sometimes you end up having a gene amplified with primer, not necessarily a protease. Those genes also we did not really left. We started cloning them, identifying the function, and then decide to proceed or not. In that way, we could identify a number of genes which are involved not as a protease, but protease inhibitors. That also probably I will briefly mention to you. So what we have, once you have the passion and enthusiasm and right environment, which partly you are responsible for creating yourself, you can go ahead and do it. It's not like you take one and then see whether it works. If it doesn't work, you take up two. You take up multiple things at the same time, run parallel. And then the success rate obviously is going to be high. But the only thing you have to be careful is you don't take up too many things, you will end up messing all the things. So from there on, so entire career, we ended up understanding how the homeostasis between survival and death is maintained, what are the proteins involved in it, how these proteases are regulated by inhibitors, and how the survival signal is also regulated by this. Obviously, all these things are involved in maintaining the homeostasis, any changes in the homeostasis could result in either inflammation, development of tumor, or many neurological disorders. So this is the entire area so far what we have been trying to do it, which we will continue to do for next few more years. In the contributions, all of them, as Abhi was mentioning, fortunately, could get into very good journal. People had recognized all the details. We used to get everyday calls. So, what are the molecules which I am going to talk briefly is how did we unravel intrinsic mechanism, physiological cell death, survival, and catabolic process. So why I chose to present this way also, there was another reason, because I used to go to different universities in the US, like Yale University, Duke University, UCLA. So what we used to have is, in the lunch time, instead of the professor joining for lunch, they used to give the speaker 1 hour time with the students. So probably that also you club, biology club can think of, whenever we have a visitor, you try to take a 1 hour slot, all of you as a group can meet with them and try to talk to them and understand how those institutions work, how to get admission into such institutions, and probably a couple of questions about their careers. That would help. Probably that is something you should think about, whoever is managing the biology club. Try to take 1 hour with every speaker that visits the school. Better if it is during the lunch time. So they will be spending only with you without any faculty around. So you'll be free without inhibition, can ask questions. I'm talking about club means club with PhD students and undergraduate students. The faculty will get an opportunity to talk to them individually, but as a group, you should ask for time to interact with visitors. So this is, so when I was talking to them, I realized that I would be more effective if it be more informal than trying to educate them with the different pathways. So the key contributions, what we have done, apoptotic regulators, as I was mentioning, these are all a family of proteases with active cysteine in the active site, and they do cleave after aspartic acid. And the apoptosis has been classified as death by 1,000 cuts. The knives are nothing but these proteases. They do cleave numerous hundreds of proteins within the cell that are responsible for maintaining the integrity of the cell structure, as well as very important gene products required for their survival. In any physiological process, what we know is there will be enough checks and balances. These proteases also will be under the regulations of inhibitors. They were called apoptosis inhibitors, inhibitors of apoptosis called IAPs. Initially, one of the first IAPs that have been identified was from insect cells infected with virus. What the virus does is, as soon as the virus infects cell, try to commit suicide by invoking the apoptotic mission. So these viruses, they have been shown that they code for certain proteins that can inhibit the protease so that the cell survives long enough so the virus can multiply and infect the organism. So initial IAPs were identified from the insect cells. So we have also identified number of inhibitors of apoptosis, and more importantly, characterized their function. So some of these IAPs and caspases, they work together, maintain the homeostasis. So inhibitors are the negative regulators of apoptosis. There have to be positive regulators of apoptosis. They are called mitochondrial proteins. Some of the mitochondrial proteins can trigger cell death, but Normally, these regulators or proteins are sequestered in the mitochondrial compartment. They do not really have access to apoptotic machinery present in the cytosol. So once for any region, I'm going to show you the diagram next. For any region, the cell decides to commit suicide. These components within the mitochondria are released to the cytosol. As a result, the cell, within the cell, caspase gets activated and ultimately cell dies. So the mitochondria plays a central role in the apoptotic machinery, and one of the main important regulators of these mitochondrial proteins are cytochrome C and of course what we call SMAC diablo. There are several others. So these are the two proteins we have extensively characterized to show that cytochrome C, once it is released from the mitochondria, cells do that. So, and it has also been shown that if you inject cytochrome C through microinjection into the cytosol, that is good enough to kill cells. It does not have to damage the mitochondria, confirming that release of cytochrome C is sufficient to activate the apoptotic machinery. What we have interestingly has shown was one of the mitochondrial protein called SMAC diablo. Probably some of you understand what is diablo means. Something our Yama kind like. So something which can kill cells or associated with kind of death or bad things. So the diablo, once it is released, the cells should commit. It's not as potent as cytochrome C if you try to term in terms of quantitative terms, but release of SMAC itself can kill cells. We have identified that there is a crosstalk between these three molecules. One is caspase, other is SMAC diablo, third is ILP. How this crosstalk is very beautifully have been characterized by me, which resulted in publications in Nature and Science, which I can say was recognized one of the best contributions to the field of apoptosis. If you see here, it was considered as one of the important findings, identification of SMAC diablo interaction with caspases. What is the latest in early 2000 in this decade, this century? So let us really get into, this was a review done by one of the famous scientists, David Wallace, not David Box from Australia. So let me see what we have done. So I'll try to give you how much time I have, Abhi? Abhi, are you there? How much time? You did not mention how much time.
Yes, sir.
Dude, I got it. 45 minutes or 1 hour?
Sir, probably another like half an hour.
Okay. Okay, good. Okay.
Half an hour.
Hello, yes.
Hello.
So one of the important things I'm trying to tell you why.
Sorry, sir, please.
Why it is important. What is the significance of our findings? What we found was these caspase 8 and 9, which later we started calling them initiator caspases. So I have cloned these caspase 8 and 9 and characterized their function. So one of the interesting aspects of this caspase, probably some of you might have remember, or if you have first year, second year student, you may not be knowing this. There are two sets of proteases. One is called executioner caspases. They have no role in the decision making, whether the cell should die or not. But others higher up in the hierarchy called initiator cache pages, they are the one receive the signal from extracellularly or intracellularly and then decide whether to commit the cell to die. So these cache page 8 and 9, we have shown that they are initiator cache pages. Normally cache pages have a small ring domain, what you call is around 30 kilodalton protein. And these initiator cache pages, in addition to 30, they will have around 10 kD extra, 10 to 15 kD extra domain in the N terminus, which helps them to receive signals from upstream. So initially, the first cache page that was identified in mammalian cells was cache page 3. We, along with Vishwa Dixit group, have published the results. What Vishwa called the cache page 3 was Yama, because it is referring to Yama in Indian culture, referring to death. Because this cache page kills cells, he named it as Yama. We called it CPP32. Later, for uniformity, everybody started calling them cache page 3. So cache page 3, like any other execution cache page, is very short, around 30 kilodalton, around 16 to 18 kilodalton large subunit, a small subunit of 10 to 12 kilodalton. And then there were a number of publications along with our group to purify the protease and characterize them. So what you simply need is you need a biochemical assay to know whether a particular protease is active or not. What you do is you express them in bacteria and then purify the protease and use that on a substrate and show that this protease can be active. But interestingly, when the first time the cache page 8 was identified, unlike other known cache pages, the cache page 8 found to be little longer. It had a 10 to 12 kD extra N-terminal domain. Then we, along with other people, have started purifying the cache page with the entire full length, around 50 kilodalton, in case of cache page. And we could never get the active protein. So at that time, we were not sure whether this is a real gene or not. It really codes for any protein and codes for a functional protein. If so, what kind of function codes for? So these are the questions that we were trying to answer, particularly with cache page 8. So we knew there was a lot of competition from big groups who were trying to do. We wanted to beat them. So cache page 8, so this is where if you have a running machinery, you establish, you know exactly what to do. So I'm trying to make the story short, but in identifying this cache page 8 as an authenticate protease, I had to go a lot of area because simply the protein was not expressed. If any expression was there, it all going into the insoluble particles. So we are not getting active protein. But the product can be a dead end. So what happened, fortunately, so this is something I want to emphasize again and again with the students. So whenever I had cloned all these proteins in my bacterial expression system, instead of taking only one clone, I used to take 4 or 5 clones simultaneously, induce them simultaneously, and characterize them independently. So, because sequencing used to take 24, 36 hours, 2 days to get the results, because it has to be done and run the gels to be released. So I could not even wait for 48 hours to know the particular clone is good or not good. So we used to go ahead and do the induction and try to assay by the result, by the time the sequencing results come. In that process, what I found was, after 5 cache page 8 clones I had picked up, 4 of them were not showing any activity. Only 1 of them ended up showing out of scale activity. So what you would do? After 5, 4 are showing consistently no activity, one activity. By majority, for any kind of logic, we would think probably something gone wrong in the clone number 5, and 1 to 4 are the real clones. But I knew I was doing right. By the time that data came, sequencing data, all the 5 were found to be full-length Caspases. Then, this again, for PhD students, the interesting part here is, how do you persuade your supervisor what you are doing is right? So, naturally, you have to feel a lot of heat from the supervisor. I must have messed up somewhere. The 5th clone, I must have been contaminated with other Caspases that we were working in the lab, like Caspase 3. Caspase 3 used to give a lot of activity. I was insisting it never happened. Then there was no way I could explain why one clone is giving activity, not the other. Then when I sat around 12 o'clock in the night and looking at the sequence again and again, I realized that one of the sequence peak was not really matching up in clone number 5. So as a result, what was happening is there is a stop codon being introduced by PCR, whatever way we have approached. It so happened, though all the 5 clones are full-length Caspases, Caspase A, first 4 clones were really 100% Caspase A. Number 5 ended up having a stop codon after the pro-domain or 12 N-terminal domain. So the protein, what I was getting, is not fully translated into a full-length protein. That is one aspect. Then what would you do? I would have chosen full-length one because there is no reason to work with the truncated version. Is there any reason? But the truncated version, which does not have any Caspase, domain translated, was giving activity. Then I hypothesized it is quite possible that very little expression of the Caspase part is happening, which is giving you the activity. But the full-length protein is becoming insoluble. So it is my hypothesis was, if you remove the N-terminal domain, then only you will get a full-length activity. Full activity of the Caspase A. As long as the N-terminal domain remains attached to the protease domain, the protease is not going to be active. Something happened in the 5th clone that is making it possible to express little bit of protease activity. Then the supervisor said, okay, why don't you check it? So you remove the N-terminal domain, we have designed primers and cloned only the protease part without the N-terminal part. You could see the activity came down. So immediately within 1 or 2 months, we could communicate to the PNAS. So it was accepted immediately, got thousands of citations. But the interesting part it happened was, though we were doing this in bacteria, in mammalian cells, exactly that's what happens. When the Caspase 8 is oligomerized, because of the induced proximity, the little activity that Caspase 8 has gets activated. It removes the N-terminal domain by autocatalytic cleavage, resulting in 100 or 1000-fold more active Caspase 8. Then now it became a textbook information. So the figure that I show you here on the N-terminal around 10 o'clock position that had work for maybe years of work, showing that Caspase 8 or 9, they are oligomerized. As a result, they do get activated. Once they get activated, they detach themselves from the N-terminal part, resulting in more activity. You could see here the arrow mark leads N-terminal domain is removed, you end up having. This is what you see in case of Western blot. The Western blot left side, unprocessed cache space. This is after processing, removal of the N-terminal domain. This is much more robustly active. So the reason I gave you the story is, again, I'm going to give you one more interesting story. We ended up having a nature paper. Entire negative data, whatever you are thinking negative, overnight it can turn out to be positive. Only thing is you have to find the right connection. How do you connect the dots? If you get tired, if you are stressed, you will never get it. If you go with a positive attitude, you will find the connection. So this is one of the very interesting findings. I always remember those days I was under so much stress because I have been told that you are not good enough, you are contaminating cache space, which I knew I was not doing. Second part, IAPs. So we were calculating this, I think I'll show you next one. This is what's happening here. You see, this is cache pages. I put it, initiator cache pages. It oligomerizes here, gets activated, activate the prospector cache page, and then reach into it. Another way the cell death can happen is by damaging mitochondria, and then the mitochondria cytochrome C gets released, and we have shown that cytochrome C binds to another protein APOF1, resulting in oligomerization, which we can see by gel filtration, resulting in activation of cache page 9, resulting in apoptosis. Here also we have shown that IAP. So this also was published in Cell, and everybody knows. More important thing that happened here was, which I will take few minutes before winding up with mentioning what we are doing it now. SMAC Diablo, when it is released, it interferes with the interaction between IAP and cache page 9. That's what we could say. So we know there is always a competition to understand the interaction or crosstalk between IAPs, which are anti-apoptotic, cache page 9, which is pro-apoptotic, and SMAC Diablo, which regulates them. Then I generated all the reagents, we got the data, and then by the time we started publishing JBC, the paper came out by another group from Cold Spring Harbor in developmental research. So we were not the first one to get the credit, but all the reagents were there. We had the information. We lost one paper, which we were planning to send it to JBC. JBC, Journal of Biological Chemistry. Then suddenly one idea came, how the SMAC may be interfering with inhibitor and activator interaction. So what we have done was, I did not put all the this one because we have a mixture of students here. SMAC interferes by binding to between IAP and cache page. So if you have a SMAC, it goes and binds to IAP, releasing the cache page. In other words, if for any region cache page 9 gets activated, it becomes raw. IAPs come and neutralize them, so the cell survives. But when the cell really commits to die, SMAC comes from the mitochondria and goes and binds to IAP, and then leaves the cache page name, then the apoptosis goes. So this is a checks and balances that happens inside the cell. So if we have only cache page 9, sometimes cells can die. To avoid that, there is a check from the mitochondria. Unless SMAC deleted from mitochondria and neutralizes IAP, cache page 9 cannot proceed further. So this all I could do in 1 month. And then we had a collaborator in Princeton. He used to be in Princeton that time, Igong Shi. He is a structural biologist. He solved a number of structures. I picked up a phone and I called him. This is the data that we have. Can you give me a structural information whether this can really happen? SMAC Diablo can really compete interaction between Caspase-9 and IFP. And then said, Murthy, that's a great idea. We should try nature. By the time we were thinking of sending into Science or JBC because we wanted to publish far. But when he said that, okay, we should try nature, within 1 month, they came back saying that we are accepted. Okay. So these things happen. I'm not saying that it happens all the time, but our job as scientists is keep trying. So there I rest my case. So I explained to 2 cases where I was so down. Finally, things turned out to be positive, as it happened with Caspase. And also I was down when some of the data was published by another group. The same data, same reagents, we adding a new findings. We could get it with the best paper and with a lot of factors. And there are a lot of other interesting stories about how this oligomerization happened. But I don't think we have time for those things. But a lot of people from entire the world, starting from Japan to California, people used to call me, how did you manage to get active Apophis? And this SMAC Nature paper also was reviewed and cited in the News and Views by David Nicholson of MAC. So in addition to this apoptosis, what we have been doing, as I was telling you, these death receptors, other than the FAS, like TNF, they not only kill cells, but they also can send signals for self-survival. How a same receptor, under certain circumstances, send a signal to die, and in other conditions, it sends a signal to survive. That was, we wanted to do it. So what we found was, I'm rushing it a little bit now here. So the region also lies not at the plasma membrane, but endosomes, which are present within these are all nothing but intracellular compartments. So the complex that are formed at the plasma membrane, most of you know in cell biology, but once they get inside the cell, they pass through different stages. In the process, they interact with different sets of compartments within the cytosol. That is going to determine whether a cell is decides to die or decides to survive. If it is so, what are the molecules that is going to determine the ultimate fate of the cell that must be present on these endosomes? So we have done a lot of screening. We came up with few E3s. One of them was COP2, which we have shown that it can target and ubiquitinate one of the important molecules of TNF signaling called RIP kinase, as you could see here, in vivo and in vitro ubiquitination. This is after ubiquitination, and this is in polyubiquitination. So what we could publish was, once you have a TNF signaling, this oligomerization happens, and this complex then passes through different compartments. One of them ends up with endosomes, where this COP2 comes and targets the RIP. If the RIP is cleaved, the survival signal is no longer confirmed. So depending on the expression of COP2, we hypothesized that the cell's ultimate fate is determined by molecules that are present at the intracellular compartments, which we are continuing to do it for the last few years. So in that sense, if they are not really promoting apoptosis, are they promoting autophagy? That's how we ended up doing some of the autophagic machineries. So we came and trying to do what we have done with apoptosis, trying to identify molecules that can control the entire autophagic machinery. One of the things that happens in immune cells, which we have shown, this I'm skipping, is once you micro target the receptor, if you take LPS containing gram-negative bacteria, E. coli, it binds to TLR4, it oligomerizes a huge number of molecules that results in upregulation of one of the molecules, what we call is P62. This is after LPS treatment for 24 hours in macrophages. Once the P62 upregulated, what it does is, this is what we found in bone marrow derived macrophages, the LPS goes up. Okay, and this, what we have seen is, these structures are assembled. And these structures are known as ALIS. And these structures are the one which drives the autophagy in macrophages in the presence of microbes. So the question that we are trying to address is, one of the questions we are trying to address is, what is the function of these assemblies? Why are they formed? How do they really look at? Which Anushree is trying to do it. What she has done is, to see the aim of the structure, you could see here the ALIS structure assembled. And these are the structures she has done through super resolution microscopy. What we found is, we have taken 2-3 molecules of ALIS. And when you look at the organization of these ALIS, we have used 3 molecules, LC3, P62, and ubiquitin in 3-dimensional measurement. You could clearly see the organization of these structures. Super resolution. So what that indicates is, these proteins are upregulated and assembled into a typical structure with some kind of biological role, which we are trying to understand. The biological function we hypothesizing is, these structures somehow contribute to the host immunity. So she has purified this and then found some of the antimicrobial peptides are also associated with it. So what does that really mean? This is the question we are trying to address now. I think we are running out of time. So this is the way you see the ALIS structures are formed within the macrophages. And the important thing that we tried to do, we had some preliminary data, is these greens are ALIS structures. So these are all pathogens, mycobacterial BCG pathogens. And what we found that some of them really associate with these pathogens. You could see here very clearly with the super resolution. Okay. So the hypothesis is that if the structures are assembled and they have antibacterial peptide, the red is the pathogen, this is the structure. What we try to do is, what we are hypothesizing is probably these antimicrobial peptides, which are part of ALIS, induce the death of the pathogen. So what do they assemble all of them, and effective concentrated microbial peptide will be injected to the microbe so that the microbes. We still have a lot of work to do in that sense. And in addition, what we are also doing is how mitophagy is controlled, identifying new proteins, how this is regulated, which several group members are doing it. I'll stop it here and take questions. Thank you very much.
Just like to thank everybody finally, properly. Abhishek's net has just gone, but yeah.
Yeah. Thanks everyone again. Always pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, in addition to that, I would also like to thank all the faculty who have joined us from all schools, not only the School of Biology. And thank you for joining us and making this a very invigorative discussion. Thank you, Murthy sir. And with this, I think we will end now.